and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Leonardo Restivo from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland, who is a master in experimental psychology from the University of La Sapienza, Rome, from 2000, and then PhD in neuroscience and life sciences from a joint Italy-France PhD program from the Universities of Rome and Marseille. He completed PhD in 2005, followed by postdoctoral research and research associate positions at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, Canada. And then Leonardo left the academia for some period of time to work in Toronto startup scene, capturing and clustering user behavior online. But in 2017, he returned to academia and Europe, and he joined the Department of Fundamental Neurosciences at the University of Lausanne, where he acts as the head of the Neurobehavioral Analysis Unit as an academic behavioral core facility. And Leonardo is a very active member of TEATIME community. He's a management committee member from Switzerland. He has worked actively on our home cage definition that you can find in our webpage, and also as a core facility manager in the consortium of EQIPT, where we work together in working out support for best practice that core facilities can provide. And now Leonardo joined another community effort and collaboration to find out the power of minimal metadata set. And this is the topic of today's presentation. So Leonardo, please, screen is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Vootele. Thanks to you and the whole COST-TEATIME Action, really, for hosting me today. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I must say that joining, I think, the COST-TEATIME Action has been one of the best decisions of my life, because it really exploded my network, the network of connections, and also somehow it has blown my mind in terms of discussions and ongoing conversations that we had for different topics. And also, what I'm going to present today actually was born in the context of some discussions that we had in the COST-TEATIME network. But before doing that, I'd like to do a little housekeeping. So I'd like to show you this other great initiative from the COST-TEATIME Action, which is the Behavior Forum. And so if you have any follow-up questions or discussions, or you want to find more resources about what I'm going to talk about today, you can head over the Behavior Forum, where there is a dedicated thread for this specific webinar. And also, as you may imagine, my views are mine and mine alone, do not necessarily reflect those of my employer. And also, if you see any references to commercial products or services during the presentation, this doesn't mean that I'm implying any kind of endorsement or recommendation. So what I want to talk to you today, it's about data storage. And specifically, I'll show you how the storage of structured data might enable data repurposing, where data repurposing is defined as the reintegration of research data within the research cycle, but in a different context and for a different purpose, right? You can think, for example, of the analysis of historical control data or the inclusion of virtual control groups. And then for what concerns structured data storage, I'll show you the results of a collaborative effort, which is the definition of a minimal set of metadata, that is descriptors of raw data. And I want to show you how this minimal set of metadata might enable data repurposing on a global scale. And then I'll show you how data repurposing applied to home cage monitoring might improve both behavior discovery and animal welfare. So this is how we're going to tackle this topic. First, I'll show you a very simplistic model of the research cycle, showing how data is collected. And then I'll briefly touch upon the role of core facilities as main actors in this data collection process. Then I'll talk about this minimal set of metadata, which we call MNMs, and how they can enable data repurposing on a global scale. And finally, we will bring everything together, the MNMs, the core facilities, and then home cage monitoring to see how data repurposing might occur in practice. So let me introduce this very simplistic model of the research cycle. So in this cycle here, what we have is technology that enables us to run experiments on animals. So we perform research on animals, from which we extract data. From this data, we gather knowledge that then is used to further refine and develop technology. And so the cycle goes on. But there are two important points that I want to make about this simplistic model. The first one is that you cannot extract knowledge from animal research. So there's no direct arrows from animal research to knowledge. What you have instead is this intermediary step, which is data extraction. So we can only extract data from animal research. And my thesis here is that data nowadays has become a single point of failure in this research cycle. Let me show you why. So if we look at the amount of data and papers that we put out there, it's really impressive nowadays, right? Because we are experiencing really this exponential increase in the volume of data that we have out there. And the problem is that we are doing a fairly poor job in storing and sharing this data in such a format that it can be used by other research groups. And this is supported by the fact that also some initiatives have emerged in the past year that are aimed at improving the way we prepare for the collection of the data, the way we report the data, and the way we store the data in an interoperable format, such that it can be used by and reused by other research groups. And the problem, again, is that there's a fairly low compliance with these guidelines, right? And so what we are experiencing today is a phase of data accumulation. Think, for example, of the same control group that is used in different experiments, across different labs, across all over the world, and which is run over and over again. So actually what we are now is a condition of redundancy, extreme redundancy. In fact, as you see here, you have two arrows pointing to the animal research. And so then this is bound to increase the volume of animals that are used in research. And then as a consequence of this accumulation of data and our inability to fully exploit the potential that is embedded in the data, the knowledge lags behind. And so now knowledge can no longer inform the development of technology. And so what's happening now is that actually technology is entirely data-driven. And so we enter this vicious circle in which technology produces more and more data that we, in turn, are not able to store in an interoperable format, so we cannot fully exploit the potential of this data. So the question is, how do we get out of this vicious circle? Well, the solution is fairly simple, I would say. So the solution is to store and share data in a structured format. So now I'm being intentionally vague here, so bear with me. So the idea is really to find this idealistic structured form of data that then would allow us, for example, to run experiment directly on data. For example, we could take advantage of the new technology, new analytical techniques that are available today to work on the data directly. And so this then would allow us to be compliant with this principle of replacement, because we could imagine of running in silico experiment. And now in this situation, we can fully exploit the potential of the data. So knowledge now flourishes, and then knowledge can inform the development of technology. And then what is happening now is that technology allows us to run more refined experiments. And then in the end, we will be able to reduce the number of animals that are used in research. So the question is, how do we fix data? How do we structure the data in such a way? Well, the solution has been known for quite some time. Already in 2010, Cameron Nealon, when he was talking about this information overload and how it would lead to this discovery failure in science, he said that actually we have to make information easy to find. We have to reinterpret it in such a way that it can be understood from people that come from different fields. And also we have to store in such a way that 20 years from now, when new technology, new analytical techniques will be available, we can exploit the data that we collect today. So in summary, what he suggests is that really what makes the difference is what kind of markup, so how we describe the raw data. and how well we do it. In one word, it's all about the metadata. Okay, but before going to the field of metadata, I want to briefly touch upon the role of core facility in this data collection process. Because from my point of view, core facilities are repositories for both data and knowledge, like good research practices, right? Of course, I cannot speak for all of them, so I'll give you my personal experience from leading one. So I'm leading the NeuroBau, the Neurobehavioral Analysis Unit, which is located at the University of Lausanne. So we are on 2 floors and we have 12 rooms dedicated to rodent behavior, to mouse behavior. And since we are located within the Department of Neuroscience, we mostly support projects which are neuroscience-based research projects. But of course, we offer services to other units that are from the university and the university hospital. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of pressure on the platform to produce data and collect data. And so we have to provide support through the different steps of the research process, right? So here you can see a list of the different jobs that we have to take and perform. And as you can see, they all revolve around this core concept of behavioral science. And so looking back at the activity of the core facility in the 6 years since its inception, what I've discovered is that globally, all the users altogether basically have poured into the platform about 11 years worth of mouse work, right? So now at this point is, what is the output of all this work? And it turns out that we produced about 20 research articles, right? And now you can immediately see that there's a large imbalance between the amount of work that we put in and the tangible output. So what is out there, what is tangible, really. And indeed, it has always been my idea that there's much more than the research article, because from the point of view of the core facility head, the research article is nothing but a timestamp that you put on some work that you have done. But there's much more to it in terms of knowledge and good research practices and data that we produce. For example, I was involved recently on 3 different projects. And as you can see, for all these projects had to develop a new skill set, had to develop and learn new things. For example, had to develop novel hardware, develop custom neural networks, an entirely new deep learning system, and then had to train students on the best research practices in terms of statistics and experiment design. And then again, what was the output? 4 research papers. So don't get me wrong, this is absolutely good. I think it was a good outcome, but there's much more to it, right? Because as we experience this pressure to publish in the core facility, basically what you see is that the knowledge and data are pushed back underneath the surface, right? They're pushed underneath the surface. And so the question is, how do we let the knowledge and data surface again? Well, for what concerns the knowledge in terms of good research practices, we already addressed a bit this issue together with Vootele and Bjorn and other members that now are part of the COST-TEATIME action. But this was in the context of the Enhancing Quality in Preclinical Data project, in which we defined a set of rules and policies for dealing and transmitting these good research practices to the users of the platform. But this left out the question about what do we do with the data? So I'm sorry if I keep insisting on this, but we have 11 years on one side, and then we have 20 research papers on the output, right? So there's a lot that is missing here. Think about the huge volume of data that flows through the platform. Then it sits in the hands of the researcher, it's used for the publication, and then the data is gone. So really the question is, can we find a better way for capturing this data and then transforming it in such a way that other groups inside the platform, but even outside the platform, can take advantage of this data? So this has always been a burning question for me. And actually, I started to address this question many years ago, 7 years ago in 2017, when I really wanted to come up with a full set of metadata that would be able to capture all the details of all different rodent behavioral experiments. So I think it's important to show you now today this personal project, right? Because now I can highlight the mistakes that I've made, but it will show you what you can actually do with metadata. what kind of research this kind of metadata can enable, right? So the basic idea was to come up with a list of metadata that would properly describe any kind of behavioral experiment involved. And also a little disclaimer here. So as you can imagine, this is some kind of personal communication, meaning that whatever you see here is the output of my own brain. So there was no consensus view. There was no peer review, what I'm going to show you. So it might be very biased and opinionated, indeed. But I want to show you the process of creating metadata and what metadata could enable in principle. So I came up with a fairly detailed list of metadata that you could use to capture the different details of behavioral experiments. And as you can imagine, this network of these three actually grew to almost an unimaginable proportion. And but really what this network, this tree is capable to do is to capture details of different components of a behavioral experiment. For example, we have metadata for the room in terms of the size, the lighting system, humidity, temperature. We have metadata for the protocol itself, the different kind of stimuli, the time schedule of the stimuli, and then you have metadata for the housing as well, and many more components, right? So it's fairly detailed. So what can you do once you have this full set of metadata? Well, you can define a subset of metadata that would specifically apply to specific behavioral say. And this is indeed what I did. For example, here I'm reporting the work that I've been doing on the open field. Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with the open field, a very rough and naive way of describing the open field is just a simply open arena where you place the mouse for a certain amount of time, and then you just look at what the mouse does, right? So you measure locomotion, how much time is spent in different parts of the arena, and then you can make inferences in terms of locomotor activity, anxiety-related behavior, and so on. So it's a very, very simple test. So what I did, I used this subset of metadata, and then I selected 132 papers from PubMed, and really the goal was to see or to capture the variability in equipment and protocol and environment that we use when we run these different behavioral settings across different setups. Because as you can imagine, we've been quite creative with the open field, so we can use many different open fields in different shapes, different sizes, different material, different lighting system, and so on. So the goal of this limited set of metadata was to capture the variability in equipment, protocol, and environment. So the data were quite interesting from my point of view. So they were really capable of capturing the variability that you have in all these different metadata. For example, we have quite some spread in terms of the duration overall of the open field. Or, for example, something I find much more interesting is the variation in terms of the size that we use to define the area of the center, right? Because as you can imagine, the proportion or the duration of these more anxiety-like behaviors strictly depends on how you define the center area of the open field, along with many other parameters. And as you can see, there's a lot of variability in terms of how we define the center area of the open field. And actually, I think this is important to point out because this kind of variability that we have in behavioral neuroscience, I think it's a great resources for the research questions that we have. So we should go the way opposite to standardization, but actually harness and exploit this variability that we have in the way we perform behavioral experiments. And you will see how actually later on during the talk, how this minimal set of metadata might exploit this variability to help us reaching a better understanding of these research questions. But then what was really, really interesting to me was to understand how good we were in reporting these parameters, this metadata, right? And so what I did is I basically look at these different papers, and then, for example, for the tracking method that was used for scoring the behavior, I look at the proportion of papers that were distributed across different categories, for example, video tracking, infrared, or manual scoring. And I discovered that 44% of the papers were using video tracking, 30% were still relying on manual tracking. But then what was really, really surprising to me was to find out that 22% of the papers, they did not report at all what tracking method was used, right? So it came as a bit of a shock, I would say, but things were bound to get even worse when I look at the overall, let's say, landscape of the different metadata that were used for reporting this simple experiment like the open field. So I've grouped them here in different groups. So we have the form factors that include the size, the height, the shape of the open field. Then you have information about the environment or the scoring method and so on. And then what is interesting is really to look at the proportion of papers that either reported or did not report the indicated parameter. And this is the outlook on the situation, on the papers that basically I was able to analyze. So the outlook is not very good, I would say. There's plenty of data, plenty of information, but I just want to focus on a couple of them. For example, here, on 8% of the papers, I was not able to find out the duration of the experiment. So 8% of the paper, they did not report how much time they left the mouse inside the arena. And as you can imagine, this invalidates a lot the downstream data that you collected, the kind of interpretation you can make of this data. So this was really surprising. Another surprising point here is about light. So in 75% of the papers, I was not able to find, a meaningful parameter that would allow me to understand the amount of light that was being used for running this experiment. Okay, this is a bit depressing, I must admit it. But there's good news, and I want to highlight this initiative. In fact, the take-home message here is that we are continuously refining the way we run these in vivo experiments, and I want to highlight this paper. So it was an initiative that was led by Stuart Pearson, Robert Lucas, and some TEATIME members also were involved, like Vootele and Sarah Wells. And so basically, they formed this work group, and they defined a set of recommendations for measuring and standardizing light for laboratory mammals. So really, the take-home message here is that we are still refining the way we're running experiments in vivo. And I think that by drawing the attention on these critical parameters, right, I think we will also get better then at reporting these parameters. But the problem, I think, it's not all about reporting. I think the problem is much more deep. Because indeed, if from what I've presented right now, I mean, we're talking about very simple behavioral assay, right? The open field, it's quite simple. But still, it feels like we don't have the proper language to communicate the details of this very simple experiment. It is my personal opinion that actually what is lacking, it's a model for properly representing in vivo experiments, right? So we are missing this model that would then allow us or enable us to talk about these experiments and to properly report the metadata linked to these experiments. And so since we lack this model, what is happening is that we have to rely on, for example, on tacit knowledge to fill in these gaps, or we can resort to this dreadful technique of using, this as previously described sentence in the method section, right? So clearly, none of these solutions are leading to a good place, I would say, right? Because actually what we have to do, we have to work on this model, which is missing, right? And also the take-home message of this personal initiative that I took in defining this set of metadata is that I made a mistake in the sense it was a personal initiative that it was directed toward a specific field, which was the field of behavioral neuroscience. But I think things could improve a lot if instead we could target something which is much more broad, like all biomedical research experiments. So the question is, can we find a model for properly representing all biomedical research? And so this was one of the driving forces behind this quest for finding a set of metadata that would be shared by all non-clinical in vivo research. Because the thing is this one, because if we have this model for properly describing and representing all biomedical research, then the raw data acquires a lot of value because we know exactly what's going on with our raw data. And then we can start to share this raw data among groups because we have attached to it this set of metadata that properly describes what we have done in our own research. So this idea of finding a set of metadata that would describe biomedical research and then enable this data repurposing was born in the context of discussions and conversation of the TEATIME network. And actually it all started in November 2021 when I received this phone call from Stefano Gaburro, the scientific director at Techniplast. And he was really interested in pursuing this idea of using metadata to enable data repurposing. And he wanted to have a transversal team. I mean, it was able really to tie the knot between different individuals across the private and the public sector and across different companies, right? Because we were tackling a very challenging question, that is, can we find this minimal set of metadata that is shared by all these experiments, these biomedical experiments, in order to enable data repurposing on a global scale? Well, this was a challenging question, but we didn't start in the void or from scratch. I mean, this is how we tackle this topic, this challenging question. First, we reasoned that any biomedical research can be represented with this very simple structure, in which the outcome is the result of 3 distinct effects. And now the critical metadata are to be found among the parameters within this effect that are most likely to affect the outcome. Luckily, a lot of groundwork has already been done in the past by the ARRIVE 2.0 guidelines, because these are the parameters that we must report in order to properly describe the experiment, right? The in vivo experiment. And so at this point, if you use a subset of these ARRIVE 2.0 guidelines as metadata, what is happening is that we have a core set, a minimal set of metadata, which is shared by all in vivo experiments. And then what we did, since we already had this mapping between ARRIVE 2.0 and the metadata set for the biomedical research, then we enriched it with a set of metadata that were compliant with the FAIR principle, right? And so now this is what really enables this metadata set and the associated raw data to be findable, accessible, and interoperable. Because the whole idea was then to latch on to pre-existing ontologies that then would allow the raw data at the level of the single animal to be findable, accessible, and then reusable. So how would this work in practice, and what are the consequences of using this broad approach of minimal metadata set? Well, suppose that you have to run an experiment. So now in front of you, you have a huge, large experimental space, right? Because you could address your research question using different parameters sampled across different dimensions. For example, you could use different genotypes, different housing conditions, different compounds, or measuring different outcomes. But then you, as a single research lab, you would be limited by some kind of physical constraint and financial constraint and logistic constraint. You would be limited to the exploration in a limited portion of this large experimental space. So even if you were able to use a complete set of metadata, you would still be describing this limited portion of the space. Now, core facilities have a better perspective on the topic, on this research topic, because they would be able to gather data across different experiments, indeed, run by different groups. But then a real change would happen if instead we could start leveraging this minimal set of metadata, which is shared across all these different experiments that are run across different facilities, a different lab all over the world. Now we would get a much better perspective on the entire experimental space, right? So this then has very interesting consequences. First, we can talk about the scalability, because now we have data repositories which are scattered across the world, and then the data would be able to communicate through this common language, the MNMS, this minimal set of metadata, right? So you don't need to bring all the data in a single database. They can be scattered across different repositories. And then this, as I said before, is going to increase the external validity of the research questions that we address, because we're sampling from a much larger experimental space. And then since in these MNMs, we have embedded the Arrive 2.0 guidelines, this would improve reporting and then increase transparency and lead us to this improved reproducibility situation condition, let's say. Now, how this would work for home cage monitoring? How can we exploit these MNMs and how can we enable data repurposing in home cage monitoring? Well, home cage monitoring has been a paradigm shift in behavioral neuroscience because, you know, in the past, we used to have these out-of-cage tests, and then we had absolutely no clue of what was going on in the home cage during this adaptation period, the rest period, the idle period. And then, thanks also to the COST-TEATIME action, we got to learn that actually with these new technologies, we can really have a better understanding in terms of what the animal is doing in their home cage, in a home cage setting. And indeed, home cage monitoring technology have gained some tractions in the past year, a lot of attention. And this is supported also by the fact that we have many, many different commercial and non-commercial solutions for home cage monitoring. And actually, if you want to have a better idea in terms of what is out there, I suggest that you connect to the TEATIME website where we have a large catalog of the different technologies available today. And of course, I don't want to stress too much on the pros of home cage monitoring technologies, because really what matters in terms of metadata is the fact that we are talking about integrated systems, right? Because in home cage monitoring technologies, we have the opportunity to have both the data and the metadata sitting together in the same system. That's why I think the integration of the home cage monitoring together with the animal management system, for example, it's a brilliant idea because now we have really the possibility of gathering already the metadata together with the raw data from the home cage monitoring. Actually, data repurposing is already happening in many different initiatives. So here I'm reporting just one example from Sarah Fuochi and Livia D'Angelo, in which they use the DVC, the digital ventilated cages from Techniplast, to discover new features of behavior and animal welfare, which are genotype dependent and developmental stage dependent. And they were able to do this using only historical data. But also at recent conferences in the DVF3 conference, we had some initiatives also from EPFL and other institutions in which no new animals were used for these discoveries, but it was entirely based on historical data. And I can show you briefly what we are trying to achieve in our core facility. So we are trying to take advantage of the spatial distribution of the electrodes in the base plate of the DVC cages to pass them through some machine learning methods that would allow them to extract what we call behavioral signatures. So these are signature of activity that could be potentially correlated with out-of-cage tests. And then this would allows us also to perform some kind of behavior discovery, but also to do prediction, where we could get to the point where we use this signature to predict the performance in out-of-cage tests. And as I say this, I immediately realized that, I mean, this is not something that we could do as alone, I mean, within the context of our core facility. Really, what we have to do to enable this kind of science, this kind of research question, is the ability to sample from a large experimental space. And that's why I think really that MNMS is a key enabler for this kind of behavior discovery. And the cherry on the cake, is really this idea that we could do this in compliance with the principle of replacement and reduction, because the data is already out there somewhere in core facilities, right? And then by leveraging this common language of MNMs, we would be able to pull together data from multiple sites. So how do we bring all of this together? So, well, how do we implement and what's the road ahead? This is a big question, actually. Well, I think that it's really key to be prepared, let's say. So I think pre-specification is really key at this point. And I really wanted to borrow this slide from Adrian Smith with permission from Nori Kopa. because it presented this idea of the burnt cake fallacy, where basically it says that we cannot improve our research by better reporting alone. This is the example of the burnt cake, right? Because if you produce a burnt cake and then you tell to your peers what went wrong, this is not going to improve the quality of the cake, right? So you have to come much better prepared for that. And I think this is a key component of the metadata system. So we have to design this minimal metadata set before we start to collect the data. This will have a huge, I would say, large positive impact on the way we collect data, on the way also we report the data. And that's actually how we can make future-proof data repositories. Because if we start to prepare and we start to collect in advance the specification for this minimal set of metadata, then what is happening is that the value of this data will increase over time. Because at some point in the future, we will be able to use these new analytical techniques with the data that we collect today, which are already ready to go because they have been well characterized, well described with these MNMs. And what is even better is that we have already the Arrive 2.0 guidelines embedded in the system. So this would improve also reporting and would also make this data repository future-proof and also compliant with the prepared guidelines, right? Because then at the stage of the formulation of the study, when we have to search for possible alternatives, non-animal alternatives, then we will have our future-proof data repositories already there, right? So how do we go from here? Well, I think it's really key to make this MNM's approach work is to invest and get to know the existing ontologies. Okay, for example, this is some kind of mistake that I made when I tried to come up with this metadata for the behavioral neuroscience. So it was not latching on to pre-existing ontologies, right? So it was some kind of isolated island, right? It was not connected to the pre-existing network of interoperable ontologies. So it's really key to invest and further develop existing ontologies. And then another component, which I believe is really key here, is we have to be ready to be open with our data. So this project is going to work only if we all sit together, if we all decide to share the data, right? Because we all can see what's the value of using a minimal set of metadata, but it works only if we as a community, we start to share this data. So what should be done in order to make this work? Well, this is some kind of action plan that we have in mind. First, we'd like to start with this collaborative approach in which we further refine, test, and validate the concept of minimal set of metadata. Then it's absolutely critical to provide an harmonization of terminologies, right, and also ontologies. We really have to invest on this avenue. We want to run some pilot experiments. This is something that could easily happen because it's already happened actually in home cage monitoring technologies, right? Because it's only by showing that we can actually do something with our experiment with these MNMs that then you have more people getting on board with the idea. But for sure, we will have to invest in IT infrastructure because we have to enable this exchange of the data. And with that comes also an improvement of the legal frameworks, right? Because we have to enable companies as well and universities to open their data and to find some kind of agreement, even when we have competing interests, in order to be able to exchange the data. And then we will host some workshop and to showcase the MNMs. So already some initiatives in terms of continuing education courses are being put in place. And then finally, what I think it's really critical, this is an input that we received from many different scientists, is that we should lower the barrier for adoption. I mean, adding more metadata to your work should not be a burden on your shoulder, right? So this metadata logging should be embedded already in the procedures that are already in place at animal facilities and in the laboratories, right? It should not be an extra work, otherwise no one would adopt it. And finally, I want to show you my worst nightmare. So this is what really keeps me up at night, right? So I don't want M&Ms to be just another standard, right? And there are different ways to actually avoid this situation, right? So I believe one of the solutions is indeed to have everyone on board, right? If everyone buys the idea and then we start to make some kind of pressure, then we could overcome the problem of, just adding another standard, right? And actually what we have to do is to target the right stakeholders. That's why in our recent publication on Lab Animal, we identified 3 main key stakeholders on which we should really focus in order to understand what's the value of this M&M's approach. So we have scientists, we have biostatisticians, especially we have regulatory bodies and funding agencies. So here we have highlighted all the return on investment from M&M's approach for these different stakeholders. And really what I think it's a global action where we show as scientists from the bottom, the value of M&Ms with these pilot studies in terms of the quality of research questions that we can address and how we can improve animal welfare by using this approach. And then from the top, really having this push that allows us then to propagate M&Ms through different institutions and through different funding agencies as well. Okay, at this point I'll stop here, and I'd really like to thank the many people involved in this project. Mainly I want to say many thanks to Stefano for being the driving force behind this idea, and then all the co-authors of the paper, Anastasios, Fabrizio, Owen, Giorgio, Alexandra, Michael, Sophia, and Gunnar. And then also I want to acknowledge the support and discussion from people in the CITE network, Vootele from the COST-TEATIME Action, people at the Animal Welfare Office in Lausanne, the local Swiss 3R nodes, and then people also at the Lemantic network of animal facilities. And finally, just to remember you all, we can have more discussions as well in the TEATIME behavior forum. So I'm really looking forward to take your questions and to have more inputs from you. Thank you.